Signs an avoidant loves you almost sounds like a contradiction the first time you hear it, because loving an avoidant can feel like trying to read a message written in disappearing ink. One day they are emotionally present in a way that feels rare and intense, and the next day they retreat so deeply into themselves that you start questioning whether any of it was real. That is the trap so many people fall into with avoidance. They expect love to look loud, immediate, expressive, constant. But avoidants often love in ways that are quiet, delayed, conflicted, and hidden beneath behaviors that seem confusing on the surface. And if you have ever sat staring at your phone wondering why someone who clearly feels something for you still acts emotionally distant, this video is probably going to hit harder than you expect. Because the truth is, avoidants do not usually fear love itself. They fear what love does to them. They fear dependency, vulnerability, emotional exposure, the loss of control that comes when another person starts mattering too much. And that fear creates a strange contradiction where the more deeply they feel, the more complicated their behavior can become. So instead of looking for obvious romantic gestures, you have to learn to recognize the quieter signals hiding underneath their defenses. And while you're here, subscribe if you want content that actually explains the emotional patterns most people never talk about, because once you understand avoidant behavior, so many confusing relationships suddenly start making sense in a way they never did before. One of the biggest signs an avoidant loves you is that no matter how much distance they create, they somehow keep coming back. This is one of the most emotionally exhausting dynamics to experience because their inconsistency can make you feel like you are constantly being pulled between connection and abandonment. But when an avoidant truly does not care, they usually detach cleanly. They disconnect mentally before they disconnect physically. They stop investing, stop checking in, stop circling back. But when they love you, something different happens. Even after space, silence, emotional withdrawal, or periods where they seem cold and hard to read, they reappear. Sometimes casually, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes acting like nothing happened because acknowledging emotional intensity feels uncomfortable for them, yet somehow they always find a reason to reconnect. And what makes this difficult is that avoidants often do not even fully understand why they keep returning themselves. They may convince themselves they just miss the comfort, the familiarity, the routine, but deep underneath that logic is attachment they cannot completely sever. Because despite how independent they appear, avoidants still form deep emotional bonds. They just experience those bonds alongside fear. So the push-pull cycle begins. They get close, feel vulnerable, panic internally, create distance, miss you while they are away, then slowly gravitate back again. And if you pay attention closely, you start realizing that their returns are rarely random. They come back after emotional moments, after conflict, after realizing life without you feels emptier than they expected. It is not always healthy, and it is definitely not always easy, but repeated emotional return is often one of the clearest signs that an avoidant's feelings run deeper than their words can comfortably express. Another massive sign is when they begin sharing parts of their private world with you, because avoidants guard their inner life like it is protected territory. Most people only ever meet the surface version of them, the functional version, the calm version, the emotionally controlled version. Avoidants become experts at revealing just enough to stay connected while still protecting the vulnerable parts underneath. That is why it matters so much when they start opening doors they usually keep locked. Maybe they suddenly tell you stories from childhood they never mentioned to anyone else. Maybe they reveal insecurities hidden beneath their confidence. Maybe they admit fears, failures, regrets, or emotional wounds they usually bury under independence. To most people, these conversations may seem small, but for avoidants, vulnerability can feel terrifying because it creates emotional exposure they cannot easily control. And the strange thing is, they often open up indirectly. Not during dramatic heart-to-heart conversations, but during random late-night moments when their guard drops unexpectedly. During long drives, quiet phone calls, exhausted conversations after stressful days, they reveal themselves in fragments because full vulnerability all at once feels overwhelming. But every fragment matters. Every personal memory shared, every emotional confession slipped into conversation, every hidden insecurity they trust you enough to see. Those moments are not casual for them. They are calculated emotional risks, and if an avoidant starts letting you see the parts of themselves they usually hide from the world, it often means you have become emotionally significant in a way that scares them as much as it comforts them. Another sign an avoidant loves you is hidden in something so subtle that many people completely overlook it. They start noticing everything about you. Avoidants may not always express affection verbally, but they observe constantly. They remember details quietly. Your coffee order, The shift in your tone when something is wrong, the songs you replay when you are anxious, the little habits you do without realizing, the emotional triggers you never directly explained. And this matters because emotionally detached people do not usually invest that level of attention into someone unless they genuinely care. Avoidants especially tend to conserve emotional energy carefully, so when they begin mentally cataloging details about your inner world, it reveals emotional attachment forming underneath the surface. What is interesting is that they often show this love indirectly rather than romantically. You mention something once, then weeks later they remember it unexpectedly. You tell them about a stressful situation, and later they quietly check whether it got resolved. You casually mention your favorite snack, and suddenly they bring it without making a big deal out of it. These gestures may seem small compared to dramatic declarations of love, but for avoidance, attention is intimacy. Remembering is emotional investment. Because even when they struggle to communicate feelings openly, their focus reveals where their heart is slowly attaching itself. And one of the deepest signs of all is when they allow you to see them during stress instead of disappearing completely. Avoidants are wired to retreat when overwhelmed. Stress activates their instinct to isolate emotionally, handle everything alone, and reduce vulnerability at all costs. That is why many people experience avoidance becoming distant exactly when life gets hard. But when an avoidant truly loves you, something starts changing slowly over time. They may still pull back, but they stop shutting you out entirely. They let you witness their bad days, their exhaustion, their emotional frustration, their uncertainty. And this is huge because for avoidants, being seen while struggling can feel deeply uncomfortable. They often associate vulnerability with weakness, dependence, or loss of control. So allowing someone close during emotionally messy moments requires enormous trust. Sometimes it looks subtle. They text you even when they are overwhelmed instead of disappearing for weeks. They admit they are stressed instead of pretending everything is fine. They let you sit beside them in silence instead of emotionally vanishing behind walls. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that shift is massive. Because love does not always make avoidance instantly expressive or emotionally secure. But real love does slowly make them less alone. It makes them start risking connection during moments where their instinct normally tells them to run. And when an avoidant truly loves you, one of the clearest shifts starts happening in the way they use their time. At first, avoidants often structure their lives around emotional independence. They stay busy, distracted, productive, constantly moving from one responsibility to another because busyness creates distance from emotional vulnerability. It gives them control, it gives them excuses, it protects them from becoming too emotionally consumed by another person. That is why so many people feel confused dating avoidance, because there is almost always some invisible wall separating connection from full emotional availability. But love changes that slowly, not dramatically at first, but quietly. You begin noticing that despite how busy they claim to be, they somehow start carving out space for you anyway. Maybe they call when they normally would have disappeared into isolation. Maybe they rearrange routines they never change for anyone. Maybe they start checking in during the middle of stressful days just to hear your voice for a few minutes. And what makes this meaningful is that avoidants rarely give consistent access to people they do not deeply care about. Their time is emotionally protected territory. So when they willingly allow someone into that space repeatedly, it means attachment is deepening beneath the surface. The important thing to understand is that their effort may not always look traditionally romantic. They may not become overly expressive overnight, but consistency becomes their language. They keep showing up, keep responding, keep finding their way back into connection even when emotional closeness scares them. And for an avoidant, that repeated effort often says more than dramatic declarations ever could. Another sign an avoidant loves you is the subtle way they become protective over you even while pretending they are emotionally detached. This kind of protectiveness usually does not look possessive or overly obvious. In fact, sometimes you barely notice it at first because avoidants tend to express care through actions instead of emotional speeches. But if you pay attention closely, the signs are there. They worry quietly about your safety. They notice when something feels off around you. They step in during moments when you are overwhelmed, even if they struggle to comfort you emotionally afterward. Sometimes they protect you through problem solving because practical help feels safer than emotional intimacy. They fix things for you, handle stressful situations behind the scenes, offer solutions before sympathy because vulnerability still feels uncomfortable to them. But underneath those actions is emotional investment they cannot completely hide, and what becomes especially revealing is how reactive they become when someone hurts you or threatens your emotional well-being. Avoidants may appear emotionally calm most of the time, but the people they truly love affect them deeply. Suddenly their emotional walls crack just enough for protective instincts to surface. They may not always say, "I care about you" directly, but their behavior starts saying it for them in ways that feel impossible to fake. Because when an avoidant begins emotionally protecting someone, it usually means that person has become part of the small inner circle they instinctively guard. Another powerful sign is when their actions slowly become more reliable than their words. This is one of the hardest things for people to understand because avoidants often create confusion through inconsistent emotional expression. One moment they seem deeply connected, the next moment emotionally distant. And because of that inconsistency, many people become obsessed with analyzing every word, every text, every emotional shift. But avoidants reveal themselves more honestly through patterns than promises. Their words may remain cautious for a long time because verbal vulnerability feels dangerous to them. Saying "I need you" or "I love you" can feel emotionally exposing in ways they struggle to tolerate. But their actions begin telling the truth long before their mouth does. They keep showing up after difficult conversations instead of disappearing permanently. They remain present during conflict even when it makes them uncomfortable. They start becoming dependable in small but meaningful ways. And this matters because consistency is not easy for avoidance when deep emotions are involved. Emotional closeness activates fear inside them. So if someone repeatedly pushes through that discomfort to maintain connection with you, it usually means their feelings are stronger than their defenses. The danger is that many people overlook this because they are waiting for perfectly articulated reassurance. But avoidants often love through behavior first and language second. Their loyalty appears before their emotional fluency does. Their effort appears before their vulnerability becomes fully verbal. And over time, the stability of their actions starts speaking louder than all the things they still struggle to say directly. One of the most emotionally revealing signs happens when an avoidant begins including you in their vision of the future. This may sound simple, but for someone who instinctively protects their independence, future planning carries enormous emotional weight. Avoidants often live psychologically prepared for escape routes. They keep emotional exits available because commitment can feel terrifying once attachment deepens. Thinking too far ahead with another person means confronting permanence, dependency, and emotional risk. So when they begin naturally talking about future experiences with you, something important is shifting internally. Maybe they mention trips months away. Maybe they casually reference holidays together. Maybe they talk about future routines as if your presence in their life has become assumed rather than temporary. These moments may seem casual on the surface, but emotionally they are significant because avoidants do not easily weave people into long-term mental pictures unless emotional attachment has become real. And often they do this unconsciously before realizing how revealing it actually is. A future-oriented sentence slips out naturally, then suddenly they become quiet because part of them recognizes they just exposed emotional investment they usually keep hidden. But that is exactly what love does to avoidance. It slowly breaks through the emotional detachment they work so hard to maintain. Without realizing it, they begin imagining continuity instead of escape. They begin mentally building a future where your existence remains part of their emotional world. And one of the deepest signs of all appears when they start reacting emotionally to the idea of losing you. This is usually where avoidants become the most confusing because they often suppress emotions so effectively that even they do not fully realize how attached they are until separation becomes real. As long as the relationship feels stable, they may continue operating with emotional restraint. But the moment distance feels permanent, something shifts. Suddenly they become anxious, reactive, unsettled, emotionally overwhelmed in ways they cannot easily hide anymore. Because underneath the calm exterior, avoidants still form deep bonds. They just spend enormous energy suppressing how much those bonds affect them. That is why the threat of loss often activates emotions they have been avoiding the entire time. Jealousy appears unexpectedly. Fear surfaces through frustration or withdrawal. They become more attentive, more emotionally present, more expressive than usual because the possibility of losing connection forces them to confront feelings they have tried to control. And this moment often surprises both people involved. The person loving the avoidant suddenly realizes there was far more emotional depth underneath the distance than they ever fully understood. And the avoidant suddenly realizes that the person they kept trying not to depend on has become emotionally irreplaceable. Because despite all their walls, all their silence, all their fear of vulnerability, love still reaches them eventually, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, But when an avoidant truly loves you, losing you stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like grief they cannot emotionally outrun anymore. And strangely enough, some of the most honest moments with an avoidant happen completely by accident. Not during carefully planned emotional conversations, not during dramatic relationship talks, but in random, unguarded moments where their emotional defenses briefly fall asleep. This is one of the clearest signs an avoidant loves you, because people who spend most of their lives emotionally controlled rarely become vulnerable on purpose. Vulnerability usually slips out sideways. It appears in the middle of late-night exhaustion when they are too emotionally tired to filter themselves. It shows up during long drives, quiet mornings, sudden silence after laughter, or those strange moments where the world feels calm enough for their nervous system to stop bracing for emotional danger, and suddenly they say something real, something deeper than usual. Maybe they admit they are scared of losing people. Maybe they reveal how alone they often feel even when surrounded by others. Maybe they confess something painful they normally bury underneath independence and emotional distance. Then almost immediately afterward, they pull back slightly, change the subject, crack a joke, or act like the moment was not important because part of them feels exposed for revealing too much. But those accidental confessions matter more than people realize. Because avoidants do not accidentally reveal their inner world to just anyone. Emotional openness feels risky to them. So when they repeatedly have these moments with you, it means your presence has started feeling emotionally safe in ways they may not even fully understand yet. The irony is that avoidants often communicate their deepest feelings in fragments instead of speeches. You have to learn to hear the truth hidden between their pauses, their contradictions, and the moments where they accidentally let their heart speak before fear tells them to hide it again. Another sign an avoidant loves you is when they start trying to improve themselves around you, even if the process looks messy and inconsistent. This is important because real love forces avoidants into internal conflict. On one side, they crave connection with the person they care about. On the other side, intimacy activates every defense mechanism they have spent years building. So when they truly love someone, they often begin fighting battles within themselves that nobody else can fully see. They may start working on communication even though emotional conversations exhaust them. They may try to become more emotionally available even when vulnerability feels unnatural. They may attempt to break patterns they once defended because losing you suddenly feels scarier than confronting themselves. And the key thing here is effort, not perfection. Avoidants are rarely transformed overnight by love. In fact, the process usually looks frustratingly slow because emotional habits built over years do not disappear instantly. There will still be moments of withdrawal, moments of confusion, moments where fear wins temporarily, but underneath it there is movement. They begin reflecting more, listening more carefully, catching themselves when old behaviors damage connection. And often this process scares them because growth requires emotional exposure they cannot fully control. But love creates motivation powerful enough to challenge even deeply rooted avoidance patterns. When an avoidant starts genuinely trying to become healthier in the relationship instead of simply protecting their comfort at all costs, it usually means the emotional bond has become incredibly important to them, because avoidants rarely change for pressure alone. But they sometimes change when love finally becomes stronger than the safety of emotional distance. One thing many people never notice is how deeply avoidants remember emotional conversations even when they seem detached in the moment. This can feel incredibly confusing because during vulnerable discussions they may appear emotionally shut down, quiet, uncomfortable, or even distant. And the person opening up often walks away feeling unheard, assuming the conversation meant very little to them. But internally, avoidants process emotions differently than most people realize. They often replay emotional interactions privately long after they happen. They think about things alone, in silence, away from emotional intensity, so sometimes the impact of a conversation does not appear immediately. It appears later through changed behavior. Maybe you once told them something hurt you deeply, and weeks later you notice them carefully avoiding that behavior. Maybe you shared a fear or insecurity, and later they quietly adjust how they treat you without directly referencing the conversation. This is significant because avoidants often struggle with emotional responsiveness in real time. Vulnerability activates discomfort inside them, making it difficult to react openly in the moment, but the conversations still affect them deeply underneath the surface. And when an avoidant truly loves you, they carry your emotional world with them privately in ways they rarely admit aloud. They remember what hurts you, what calms you, what makes you feel abandoned, what makes you feel loved. Even if they struggle to discuss emotions fluently, they store those details carefully because emotionally significant people leave permanent imprints inside their mind. And over time, the evidence appears not through dramatic speeches, but through subtle behavioral shifts that reveal they were listening much more deeply than they initially seemed. Another deeply revealing sign is when they begin letting you into spaces they normally protect from almost everyone else. For avoidants, privacy is emotional security. Their routines, personal spaces, hobbies, habits, and inner world often function as safe zones where they can remain fully self-contained without emotional pressure. That is why letting someone into those spaces can feel incredibly intimate for them, sometimes even more intimate than verbal affection. Maybe they start inviting you into quiet parts of their daily life they usually keep separate from relationships. Maybe they let you spend time in their home when they normally guard their solitude fiercely. Maybe they introduce you to family dynamics, personal rituals, favorite hidden places, or vulnerable sides of themselves most people never get to witness. What matters is not just the action itself, but the emotional meaning underneath it, because avoidants do not naturally merge their private world with other people unless emotional attachment has become extremely real. Their independence is deeply tied to emotional survival. So when they slowly begin creating room for you inside the spaces where they feel safest, it often means trust has reached a level that genuinely scares them. And the beautiful thing is that these moments are rarely performative. They are quiet, unpolished, human, sitting together during ordinary routines, existing beside each other without emotional performance. For avoidants, allowing someone to share peaceful silence without needing to escape it can become one of the purest forms of intimacy they know how to offer. And then there is one of the most painful yet revealing signs of all. They begin testing whether you will stay.